It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Dr. Rosalind Galt to speak to us. Dr. Galt is Professor of Film Studies at King's College London. Her research addresses questions of world cinema, film theory, anti-colonial aesthetics, and queer and feminist theory. She's the author of Alluring Monsters, the Pontianak and Cinemas of Decolonization, which is published in 2021. Pretty Film and the Decorative Image, published in 2011, which won the BAFTSS Best Book Award, and the New European Cinema Redrawing the Map, published in 2006. She is co-author with Karl Schoonover of Queer Cinema in the World, published in 2016, which was the recipient of the SCMS Katherine Singer Kovács Book Award, and Dr. Galt is also co-editor of Global Art Cinema, New Theories and Histories. In 2019 to 2020, she was the recipient of a Leverhulme NUS-Stanford Fellowship on Contemporary Southeast Asia and a Leverhulme Research Fellowship. So without further ado, please, Dr. Galt will be giving a talk titled Reimagining Malay Cultures, the Pontianak as World Cinema. Dr. Galt, please.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and thank you so much to NTU and the Singapore Studies Cluster for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. You'll forgive me for drinking my coffee since it is 8 a.m. for me, so I'm definitely still in need of a little bit of coffee help. So I'm going to share my screen throughout my talk because I have a lot of slides. So let me just do that now and make sure that this is working okay. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Brilliant. Okay. Then I will get started. In her influential theory of haunting, Avery Gordon proposes that the ghost is not simply a dead or missing person, but a social figure, and investigating it can lead to that dense site where history and subjectivity make social life. The ghost or apparition, she says, is one form by which something lost or barely visible or seemingly not there to our supposedly well-trained eyes makes itself known or apparent to us. For Gordon, the ghost allows us to see what is otherwise absent from official histories, in particular the inner lives of those subject to the violence of modernity. In my talk today, I want to investigate such a ghostly figure as a site of historical disturbance in world cinema. The spirit in question is the Pontianak. Okay, back to the Pontianak, a female vampire who is much loved and much feared in Malay cultures. The Pontianak is traditionally a woman who has died as a result of male violence or childbirth, and whose return asserts a visibility for women within Malay patriarchy. She is also a pre-colonial figure whose emergence in post-colonial cinema suggests the resonances of indigenous worldviews within Malay modernity. I propose that in the Pontianak, we find what Gordon describes as a social figure, a dense site of cultural meanings which renders visible contested histories of gender, race, and national identity in post-colonial cultures. The Pontianak, as I'm sure many of you know very well, first appears in cinema in a series of hugely popular films in late colonial Malaya made in the Singapore-based studio system. Cathay Chris Studio made 4 Pontianak films, and in an effort to copy their success, rival studio Malay Film Productions made their own version of the Pontianak. The Pontianak of the studio era film does not follow folkloric tales exactly, but some generic codes emerge. She appears to be a beautiful woman with long black hair, but her true face is grotesque. She can be subdued by driving a nail into the nape of her neck. Once nailed, she acts as a normal woman and can marry and have children. But when the nail is removed, her terrifying nature is revealed and she gains her supernatural powers. Despite her monstrous form, the Pontianak is often morally ambiguous or even heroic, using her powers to take revenge on her killers or to save her loved ones and the community from external threat. The series was an unexpected sensation, playing to multiracial audiences across Singapore and Malaya, and propelling the face of the Pontianak, Maria Manado. See, we're not going forward again. What's happening? There. Maria Manado to stardom. By late 1957, the Singapore Standard newspaper could write with pride that Hollywood has her Frankenstein and Boris Karloff, or the Hunchback and Lon Chaney. In Malaya today, we have Pontianak and Maria Manado. Throughout the so-called golden age of Malay studio filmmaking, Pontianak films were the most successful series and prompted a flourishing of folkloric horror. After the Singapore studio system crashed in the wake of independence, the Pontianak film suffered from the lack of production infrastructure, both in Singapore and in Malaysia. Almost no Pontianak films were made for decades, although the Singapore-based co-production Pontianak in 1975 and Return to Pontianak in 2000 demonstrate that the figure was not forgotten. In the 21st century, however, Pontianak media of all kinds has proliferated in Malaysia and Singapore. To take some examples, Eric Koo has turned to the figure in both film and television forms with his section of the portmanteau film 7 Letters and in his HBO series Folklore. Novelists Sandy Tan and Charlene Cho both evoke the difficult life of the Pontianak as a figure of Singaporean history and identity. She's one of the familiar national types interpreted humorously on stage by comedians Mina and China. The Pontianak functions as a reminder of a shared culture, history, and way of seeing the world, and is this reservoir of public feeling that contemporary artists are using in new ways. For instance, the effective history of the Pontianak is turned toward the creation of counterpublics in a 2019 installation by a Singaporean artist, Ila, as part of the State of Motion Fear of Monsters exhibition. That installation invited audiences to respond to a series of prompts about monsters and ghosts in Singapore, with post-it notes provided to build up an unofficial cartography of the city. Ila asks visitors to describe the monsters they feared as children and to reflect on their favorite monsters. The Pontianak is by far the most popular answer to both questions. As the installation continues, Ila's questions begin to prompt different kinds of horror. The prompt to share a story of Singapore that scares you leads participants from the supernatural to the socio-political. Responses include homophobia, systematic discrimination against minorities, racist Chinese Singaporeans, and democracy, with scare quotes included. The apparent reinterpretation of the question might speak to the paucity of outlets for social critique, but it also speaks to the historical ability of the Pontianak to speak about these exact issues. The Pontianak has always encoded ideas about national and racial identities, about sexuality, about the future of democracy. And Ila's crowdsourced mapping prompts these political and nostalgic proximities to emerge. The love for the Pontianak found in both of these examples resonates across Malaysian and Singaporean cultures, and the iterability of the figure in different contexts is what makes her a vibrant object of study. My recent book, which Cheryl mentioned, Alluring Monsters, the Pontianak and Cinemas of Decolonization, argues that the figure produces rich and disruptive meanings across Malay cultures, and that her spectral presence through the history of colonial and post-colonial cinemas in Singapore and Malaysia speaks vividly about the pleasures and politics of decolonization. By examining the Pontianak in film and media, we trace an image of post-colonial popular cinema that is often less than visible, perhaps because it neither fits with the intellectual trajectories of post-coloniality as political cinema in other parts of the world, nor with studies of popular genres within larger national cinemas. And yet, the cultural prominence and semiotic richness of the Pontianak make her a uniquely valuable cinematic figure. Pontianak films speak of tradition in a time of modernization, but their emphasis on female agency resists the more conservative impulses of anti-colonial discourse. The Pontianak is Malay, but not Muslim, and moreover, she is a national icon who is claimed by both Singapore and Malaysia. As a figure of both animist folklore and the post-independence spirit, she has the untimely potential to challenge both traditionalism and nationalism. She registers a series of intersecting anxieties about feminism and modernity, about local and transnational cultural influence, about the relationship of Islam to indigenous beliefs, and about globalization and environmental destruction. Her continued popularity illustrates the ongoing relevance of these issues in Southeast Asian societies. The book examines the Pontianak film from the 1950s to the present, arguing that this ghostly figure opens onto a new understanding of how cinema mediates the transnational, the post-colonial, and the worldly. I'm going to give you a short sense of the shape of the project as a whole to put the specific analysis I'm going to do today into the context of the larger argument of my research project. The book is structured thematically around topics that elucidate two parallel sets of questions. Firstly, each chapter addresses an aspect of post-colonial culture in Singapore and Malaysia. Anti-colonial thought and activism in the late colonial film industry, gender and sexuality as sites for mediating aspects of modernization, race and religion as historically definitional categories of Malay identity, land ownership, development and environmental destruction, and the cultural importance of animist belief systems in the post-colonial era. By locating the Pontianak film at the center of these diverse political and cultural debates, I aim to reframe post-colonial film studies through a broad array of contemporary questions that resonate in and beyond Southeast Asia. In a key text on post-colonial cinema, Pontanese and Waller write that they envision post-colonial cinema in relation to dynamic departures from colonial paradigms of knowledge and power. It matters less what a film is thematically about and more how it engages with history, subjectivity, epistemology, and the political ramifications of all of these. Pontianak films reimagine Malay histories, subjectivities, and epistemologies. And one of the threads running through the book is that these supernatural imaginaries are engaged in producing cultures of decolonization. The second organizing principle is film theoretical and historical. Each chapter also addresses an area in contemporary film studies, and in particular, its relationship to world cinema as a category. Thus, one chapter is formed of a production history, locating the late colonial studio system in Singapore in relation to transnational flows of talent and aesthetic influence. The next extends my research in feminist and queer film theory, pressing the feminist potential of the Pontianak beyond celebrations of her monstrous agency. Chapter 3 engages the representational politics of race in a cinematic context that is highly racialized, and analyze cultures of religious piety in relation to cinematic form. The next chapter engages cinematic space, returning to the heritage film debates in relation to post-colonial landscapes. The final chapter considers the turn to animist theory across the humanities, using Malay animism and aesthetics to theorize the cinematic form of the jungle. In the film theoretical register, the larger claim of the project is that the Pontianak offers contributions to the conceptualization of world cinema as a theoretical and historiographic project. So to get closer to this cultural work of our favorite figure, the Pontianak, I'm going to talk more today about the representation of the traditional kampung as a space of post-colonial heritage. In addressing the kampung as a space, I bring together the material history of post-colonial land ownership with film theoretical questions of heritage and historicity. The kampung is imagined, both in cinema and more broadly, as ahistorical, a place of endless traditional time. But in that process, it becomes a key space in which the transformations of modernization are registered. Priya Jaikumar has argued that as cinema institutions construct space, so the discursive formations of national histories are mapped. For her, spatial film historiographies allow the discipline of film and media studies to tackle two challenges. First, the challenge posed by Henri Lefebvre and geographers in his wake to all historians. And second, the challenge posed by subaltern historians to Western historiography. For Jaikumar, both space and subalternity challenge the nature of film history. And this insight is apt for understanding the significance of the kampung image in post-colonial Singaporean cinemas. In Singapore, as in India, the wresting of land from an imperial power leads to a post-colonial process of remaking space, in which the material and the imaginary are constantly intertwined. The vanished kampung is a key cultural site of this process. It's a locus of nostalgia, ideological projection, and fantasy, and as such, the cinematic representation of the kampung animates the meaning of the past within Malay post-coloniality. The Pontianak film is almost always set in a kampung, and it seems in the binary of tradition and modernity to fall squarely on the side of tradition. The studio era films are set not only in kampungs, but in the pre-colonial past. A Singapore Standard article previewing Dendam Pontianak in 1957 describes its authentic Malayan locales, and the studio set's exact replica of a 17th century Malay village. The Singapore Film Locations Archive notes that Sumpah Pontianak was shot in kampungs on the east coast of Singapore at Siglap, Padang Terbakar, and Tanah Merah. The same syntax applies in the contemporary story. Eric Khoo's contribution to Seven Letters plays on nostalgia for the forms of cinema going that were common in the kampung and the horror films that were so popular in those days. The contemporary horror film insists that the Pontianak lives in rural environments, and it constructs both the ghost and the kampung as traditional forms of being that survive within modernity. The Pontianak film's kampung constructs a heritage imaginary, which is to say that the mise-en-scène and narration of the kampung evokes a sense of pastness that articulates ideas about cultural inheritance and the retrospective value of imagining history. These haunted kampungs might seem distant from what we usually think of as heritage film, but Andrew Hickson describes heritage films as intimate epics of national identity played out in a historical context. And this phrasing could not be more apt to the Pontianak. In fact, the times and spaces of heritage, rural communities, pre-modern ways of life, old houses, inheritance, are equally resonant for the horror film and for post-colonial theory. Universal Studios Singapore's Rumah Pontianak attraction plays with exactly this pleasurable fantasy of inheritance, a constructed space of rural Singapore that no longer exists and which can be enjoyed as an immersive experience. Melanie Joseph Villan and Judith Mizrahi Barak consider that in the post-colonial world, ghosts ask the fundamental questions of heritage. How are history, culture, identity transmitted or not transmitted in cultures born from conquest, conflict, and sometimes obliteration? Following their logic, the Pontianak herself figures heritage. She dwells in the most sacred spaces of Malay cultural identity, and she insistently speaks about histories of violence and expropriation. Heritage discourse bespeaks a complex and often ambivalent relationship to history. But history in the horror film is often the site of originary traumas, of past crimes that return to haunt the present, and this is especially true in post-colonial horror. How does the Pontianak film combine its heritage imaginary with the histories of violence that are implied by the genre of post-colonial horror? There are at least two histories here. The vague pastness implied by a pre-modern kampung nostalgia, and the very specific periods of anti-colonial activism, separation, and independence. Recent films often evoke both of these temporalities at once, conjuring the aesthetically appealing visual rhetoric of the kampung as a pre-modern idyll, at the same time as leveraging nostalgia for the fashions and political memories of the mid-20th century. This period is especially fertile for the Pontianak film because it is also the moment of the genre's heyday. The historical Pontianak film combines memories of the 1950s and 60s with memories of the popular cinema of the time. These memories are never straightforwardly nostalgic. I'll turn now to Dendam Pontianak, or Revenge of the Pontianak, a film set on the eve of Malaysian independence, which understands this moment as the site of a trauma that must be investigated. For a cinema of decolonization, I argue, the history of independence remains a surprisingly troublesome spectre. We can locate Glenn Gui and Gavin Yap's Dendam Pontianak in relation to Singaporean public culture. Co-director Glenn Gui is best known as a theatre director, and his work frequently engages with the complicated inheritances of post-colonial Singapore. Not long after Dendam Pontianak premiered, he collaborated with Alfian Sa'at on a play called Merdeka, or Independence, which proposed a decolonizing counter-narrative to Singapore's bicentennial celebration. Gui's work is often characterized by queer modes of performance. In 2017, he starred in drag in Mama Whitesnake, a version of the Whitesnake legend that combines references to Chinese folklore, British pantomime, and Choi Huck's 1993 cult classic, Greensnake. Gui thus crosses high and low cultural registers, and his reputation as an independent artist is predicated on this ability to move up and down hierarchies of genre and taste. His reputation positions Dendam Pontianak as an auteur film, and one in which audiences might expect the indigenous cultural history of the Pontianak to be leveraged for political purposes. The film immediately presents itself as a heritage film. It opens with a spectacular wedding ceremony in a Malay kampung. Colors are saturated, depicting the kampung with a combination of bright green foliage, warm native hardwood architecture, and rich, colorful textiles. The bride and groom are bedecked in traditional matching red outfits, while the costumes and hairstyles of the guests locate the story in the 1960s. We are placed in a Malay past whose visual appeal is closely tied to its adherence to traditional cultural practices. In other words, the film's form offers us a golden age vision of the kampung past that is almost immediately interrupted by the haunting presence of a Pontianak. The groom, Khalid, is nervous and appears to know that something is wrong. The figure appears of a woman in a red kabaya, the bright primary color echoing the costume of the bride and groom. Her spectral appearance indicates that history, in the form in the form of the kampung's secret, is about to be experienced as a disturbing and violent return. On the morning after the wedding, the bride makes a discovery. I'm now going to show us a short clip of that sequence. Just in this clip, the movement from the emphasis on local architecture, foliage, the slow tracking shot that emphasizes the beauty and specificity of the architectural space, moving us towards the vertical camera movement up towards horror. So we move from a space of heritage through to a space of horror across this sequence. And the juxtaposition of marriage with murder sets in motion the film's generic combination of melodrama, heritage, and horror. The film takes place over two time periods, both significant to Pontianak and Malay histories. The narrative present of Khalid's wedding to Siti is in 1965, the year of Singaporean independence. When we flash back to the murder that brought the Pontianak into being, we're in 1957, and indeed the day of Malaysian independence. We learn in flashback that Khalid has been having a secret relationship with Mina, and she is pregnant. In a scene, in a scene that constitutes the fulcrum of the plot, a heavily pregnant Mina travels to the kampung to ask for Khalid's help, arriving exactly as villagers are gathered in the local kopitiam watching Merdeka celebrations on a single television. Historicity is pinned to the narrative event, and media technology mediates tradition and modernity in the kampung. The television image promises a new birth, but Khalid is unwilling to support Mina's child. Instead, he and two friends drive her out to the surrounding jungle and strangle her. That Mina is murdered on the day of Merdeka locates a violent loss in a moment that should be experienced as joyful. Independence comes at a price, and the Pontianak is born alongside Malaysia. What are we to do with these dates? Mina dies in 1957 and reappears in 1965, haunting what looks like a timeless kampong space with the discontinuous violence of two political severances. Dendam Pontianak proposes a dual national allegory in which the haunting begins with Malaysia's independence and ends with that of Singapore. It also offers a self-reflexive nod to the history of the classic Pontianak films, all of which were released between these years. More than merely a nostalgic reference, Dendam's historicity implies that the Pontianak emerges in 1957 for a reason. As Steve Pyle puts it, vampires jump times and spaces. The vampire will tell us that colonization and globalization work through pathways and trajectories, producing discontinuities, interrupted and delayed formations. In her Pontianak form, Mina speaks about the traumas of decolonization for both countries. The film stages a markedly explicit critique of both bad modernity and bad tradition through its heritage style. We can trace this style in Khalid's representation. His relationship with Mina is predicated on leaving the kampong. He meets her in a dance club that is visualized in a retro 1950s color palette full of mid-century modern pastels. The scene is evocative of the films of Wong Kar-wai, and in particular, the dreamy atmosphere of In the Mood for Love. The sense of mid-century Asian modernity associates Khalid and Mina's relationship with Wong's melancholic post-colonial romance. Khalid even tells Mina he cannot see her anymore in a ruined building, overgrown with tree roots in a way that echoes the ending of In the Mood for Love. After Khalid kills Mina, he no longer frequents dance clubs. Back in the kampong, he becomes more traditional, marrying and focusing on performing piety. His costuming and styling, however, continue to echo a vision of modern masculine cool. His outfits contrast with the traditional Malay dress of most of the men in his kampong. Even having returned to the village and committed to a more traditional way of life, both Khalid and his brother Reza dress as modern men. In one shot, he leans out of a window smoking, his languorous bodily disposition at odds with the constrained movements of piety found in more conservative horror films. His dress contrasts with that of the female characters, who all wear traditional baju kurung or kebaya. It's the men who navigate both tradition and modernity in a way that's not possible for women. The film's narrative works to unravel Khalid's embodied claim on modernity, revealing it to be as false as his lie to Mina that he had to leave her because he had an arranged marriage back in the kampong. There, he used Malay tradition to get out of a relationship, wanting the sexual freedom of modernity, but not its concomitant claims on equality. Khalid's appearance as a romantic figure in the mode of Tony Leung's Mr. Wong is a fantasy. His sharply parted hair and 1960s attire present him as a forward-thinking face of the post-colonial nation. But the spectre of the past overthrows this attractive fiction when the Pontianak reveals that Khalid's modernity is just as fake as his claim on traditional values. Mina's revenge uncovers the hypocrisy of conservative kampong ideology, in which a murderer like Khalid is rewarded for maintaining the appearance but not the substance of morality. The attitude that produces Khalid's sexist violence suffuses the community, and the film implies that this is not only a problem of male violence per se, but a particular version of post-colonial Malay identity. None of the village elders condemn the murder. They merely plan to kill the Pontianak. Spectators are typically invited to endorse a village coming together to vanquish a supernatural threat. But Dendam flips expectation by rejecting this vision of patriarchy. As the various representatives of kampong authority encircle Mina, she throws them off and kills them all. This Pontianak is a heroine who cannot be contained by such hyper-masculine post-colonial self-fashioning. There is no dramatic final fight sequence in which the Pontianak is vanquished by the forces of the kampong. The film refuses to provide that image of male violence. It offers instead a spectacular feminist critique of kampong morality. In Mina's final reckonings with Khalid and with her child, the film turns to melodrama's ability to articulate the difficulty of history. When she comes face to face with Khalid, Mina says, "I told you I would never forget you." And this romantic dedication is transformed into words of revenge. In an intimate close-up embrace, she declaims, "I love you," and then eats his entrails. The word Selamanya, or forever, is repeated throughout the film, but the love that truly lives on is for the child who was born the night she died. Mina visits Siti in her Pontianak form in order to say a final goodbye to her son and to ask Siti to kill her. In a feminist narrative resolution, Mina does not fall victim to men. She gives Siti the nail so that Siti can help her die. As she passes it over, their hands meet in a close-up image of female solidarity. The nail is transformed from a symbol of sexual violence into a tool with which to disrupt patriarchal narratives. Mina asks Siti to raise her child Nick differently and to create a new nation with less violence and hatred. Whereas Khalid's selfish violence encodes the hypermasculinity of post-colonial ethno-nationalism, Mina sees in her son the hope for a different regime of Malay masculinity. Here, the Pontianak makes a moral claim on the post-colonial nation, embodied in her demand for a new practice of gendering. Dendam Pontianak proposes a revisionist history in which the kampung is a space to create the nation differently. But Gui and Yap's film builds on memories of the 1950s and 60s Pontianak films, which also staked a claim for a Singaporean identity that was both Malay and multiracial, modern and pre-colonial, and focused on female agency. The popularity of the Pontianak film in Singapore can speak beyond the nation to help us think about world cinema more broadly. Firstly, the Singapore studio films open up a rich transnational production history, produced by colonial Singapore's particular multiracial and multilinguistic film culture. Indian directors, Chinese technical crew, and Malay actors, including Maria Manado's crucial creative role, made the Singapore studios a uniquely transcultural production model. Within this setting, the Pontianak is a semiotically rich figure through which Singaporean cinema troubles colonial and post-colonial hegemonies of nation, race, gender, and religion. Maria Manado became a significant producer and was consistently engaged in telling Malay stories centering on female figures as a mode of producing a cultural imaginary. Although accounts of world cinema have been interested in both transnational circulation and post-colonial histories, they have paid little attention to Southeast Asia. The importance of the Singapore studio system and the popularity of the Pontianak film within this history demonstrate the value of Southeast Asia for understanding the circulatory flows and cultural histories of world cinema. The Pontianak film also offers insight into the historical and theoretical relationship of horror to post-coloniality, and its emergence during the period of decolonization in Singapore speaks more broadly about the significance of colonial histories for conceptualizing world cinema. To return to Avery Gordon, the Pontianak as a social figure renders visible the trouble with post-colonial identities in the form of a tension between the nationalist appeal of a pre-colonial figure and the ways in which that figure upsets dominant models of patriarchal ethno-nationalism. The Pontianak film series of the 1950s and 60s were popular because of their transnational, syncretic vision of Malay culture, and because the feminist monster at their heart simultaneously evoked an anti-colonial nationalism and a thorn in the side of power. The more recent revival of Pontianak narratives speak to the inheritances of that period and the tensions that animate national identity today. For Gui and Yap, Singaporean identity is not fixed, and the haunting of the Pontianak recalls the need to rethink history and heritage for the present. Although I focused on a very specific regional history, the Pontianak resonates with debates on post-colonial horror and world cinema. The circulation of ghosts and monsters is embedded in histories of colonial extraction, whose effects refract across the cinematic landscape of vampires, zombies, and jinns. The Pontianak film enables us to see formations of world cinema that would not otherwise be visible, from the colonial circulations within which the genre emerged, to the figure's insistent troubling of Asian horror as a genre category in the present. Indeed, the Pontianak film makes the case for the centrality of the post-colonial to the forms and systems of world cinema. Pontianak films draw on the pre-colonial and pre-Islamic imaginaries in order to resist reactionary forms of gender, sexuality, and nationalism in the present, and to imagine new forms of political embodiment and agency. If we understand popular culture in Stuart Hall's terms as a site of contestation, then the Pontianak film enables us to reimagine the cultural, aesthetic, and political stakes of Singapore cinema in a global frame. I'll end with this image by Malaysian artist G.E. Lan, which also exhibited in the State of Motion exhibition in Singapore in 2019, in which a group of female artists pose as Pontianak. For Yi, the Pontianak continues to haunt us in 21st century patriarchal Southeast Asia. She is, she says, potential and power and resource. Thank you.